Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take the source materials you share with us, the articles, the research, the biographical notes, and we pull out all the crucial information.
We give you that shortcut to being truly well-informed and, well, usually find a few surprising facts and historical insights along the way.
And today we are embarking on a really massive deep dive. We're looking at a figure who is so much more than just a writer.
Oh, absolutely. He's a cultural institution, a name that just conjures up an entire era. Charles Dickens.
That's right. We are diving into the man known as the inimitable Boz. We all know the foggy London streets, the Christmas cheer, the unforgettable villains, and of course that biting social justice.
But our mission today is to get at the man himself.
Exactly. How did Charles Dickens go from the absolute depths of personal trauma and poverty to becoming, well, you could argue, the world's first genuine self-made media celebrity?
And your source material here is just fantastic. It's a great collection, synthesizing biographical details, career highlights, and some really deep literary analysis.
So our goal is to pull out that essential story, the one that explains his enduring complex cultural power.
And, maybe most importantly, the tension in his life. That dual role he played as this undisputed literary genius and, at the same time, an intensely shrewd and complicated public figure.
Okay, let's just jump right into that central contradiction.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, Dickens has this massive stature.
Colossal.
He's widely seen as the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. The sources stress that his work has never, not for a single moment, gone out of print.
And that alone is just staggering to think about.
It really is.
His novels, his short stories, they created a whole pantheon of characters. Scrooge, Tiny Tim, Miss Havisham, Fagin. I mean, they've gone beyond literature. They're global archetypes now.
His writing was so powerful, it literally created its own adjective.
Right. We all use the term Dickensian to describe either, terrible social conditions or these comically repulsive characters.
So a giant in letters, for sure. But what's so fascinating is that tension you mentioned. The one between Dickens, the tireless social reformer, the journalist, the editor, the campaigner for children's rights.
And Dickens, the capitalist.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly. He was the shrewd entrepreneur. He used every single technological and commercial advantage of the Industrial Revolution.
Like what specifically?
Well, new high-speed printing presses, enhanced advertising, the brand new railway network for distribution, and a really sophisticated approach to self-promotion.
He knew how to sell books.
He learned how to sell his books to literally everyone. From Queen Victoria reading the expensive editions to the masses of the poor reading the cheap serial installments. He covered the whole market.
He basically understood marketing before marketing was even a thing. His whole life, from 1812 to 1870, is this story of radical self-creation.
And to really understand the engine that drove that social critique and that moral compass,
You have to start at the beginning.
you have to start with his unhappy, traumatic beginning.
Okay, so let's look at his birth. Charles Nubbin John Huffman Dickens, born on February 7th, 1812, in Portsmouth.
And that early period of his life, by all accounts, it seems surprisingly secure. Almost, you could say, idyllic.
Really?
Well, for a time. He was the second of 8 children. His father, John Dickens, was a clerk in the Royal Navy Pay Office, and this gave the family a certain middle-class comfort.
So he had some education.
He did. A few years of private education in Chatham, Kent, until he was about 11.
That sounds like a pretty privileged start, especially for his intellectual growth.
It was. Even as a very small boy, the sources say he was just constantly reading.
And not just kids' books, right?
Oh, no. He was devouring these picaresque novels, Tobias Smollett, Henry Fielding, which are just full of roguish characters and wild journeys, plus classics like Robinson Crusoe and the Arabian Nights.
And you can see those influences later on.
They're crucial. They gave him a template for these epic journeys, for sharp social satire, a whole parade of eccentric, unforgettable characters, a style he would later perfect.
But that security, that idyllic period, it didn't last.
Not at all. It evaporated dramatically in 1824. Charles was 12 years old.
And the hammer blow was dead. His father, John.
Financially reckless? Recklessly improvident is how one biographer puts it, and his mounting debts forced him into the infamous Marshalsea debtors' prison in London.
And we really need to pause here because the Marshalsea,
Yeah.
it wasn't just a jail.
No, it was a true horror. As was the custom, when the main breadwinner went to prison for debt, the entire family, the wife, the younger kids, They often had to join him there just to survive.
Just a complete physical and psychological humiliation for the whole family.
And of course, the prison features so prominently in his later novel, Little Dorrit.
This is really where the personal trauma becomes the blueprint for his entire literary career, isn't it?
100%.
Yeah.
At age 12, this promising student was pulled out of school and, in his words, cast away. He was forced to work 10-hour days for just 6 shillings a week at Warren's blacking warehouse.
And the conditions there, they sound like something he wrote himself.
Exactly. A crazy, tumble-down old house described as literally overrun with rats right next to the murky river.
And his job was just mind-numbing.
Pasting labels on pots of boot blacking. He later said that having the boys work in the window on Chandos Street for the public to see was a new refinement added to his misery.
So it wasn't just the physical hardship, it was the psychological degradation of watching his future just disappear.
And we have this one specific anecdote that shows exactly how this factory experience became the wellspring for his characters.
You mean Bob Fagin?
Yes. Dickens later told his friend and biographer, John Forster, about one of the boys who worked with him, Bob Fagin, who showed him how to tie the knots on the pots.
And that name?
That name, Bob Fagin, was later adapted for the notorious villain, the master criminal Fagin in Oliver Twist. It just shows how every single detail of this suffering was stored away, ready to be weaponized in his fiction.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the righteous anger he carried wasn't just about his own suffering.
No, it cemented his lifelong interest in socioeconomic and labor reform. It gave him an authenticity when writing about the poor that basically no other writer of his generation could claim.
But maybe the deepest emotional wound, even deeper than his father's imprisonment, was his mother's reaction.
Right. When his father was finally released from Marshalsea, thanks to a small inheritance, Charles's mother, Elizabeth Dickens, she did not immediately support taking him out of the factory.
That's just astonishing.
He recalled bitterly that she was warm for my being sent back.
He never forgot that. He never forgave her for wanting him to go back to that awful place to help with the family income.
It was this intense feeling of betrayal, and it really influenced his later, sometimes quite harsh and dissatisfied attitude toward women in his adult life.
And he poured that feeling of abandonment directly into his fiction.
Especially in his most autobiographical novel, David Copperfield. The character David, lamenting his situation in the workhouse, uses language that must have been right from Dickens's own heart.
I had no advice, no counsel, no encouragement.
No consolation, no assistance, no support of any kind from anyone that I can call to mind as I hope to go to heaven. It's just pure anguish.
So that trauma became the secret source code of his genius. He never spoke about the blacking warehouse publicly until after he died.
The factory, the prison.
Yeah.
They gave him Mr. Micawber, the eternally bankrupt but optimistic father figure, and the setting for Little Dorrit. It was a true crucible.
So after this searingly brief period of factory work, Dickens finally gets sent back to school.
He does, and then he starts working as a junior clerk in a law office, Ellis and Blackmore, from 1827 to 1828. And this clerical work, it gave him immediate exposure to the petty tyranny and inefficiency of the legal system.
Which he would later satirize so brilliantly in Bleak House.
Absolutely. But the really crucial next phase was his passion for London theater. He became completely captivated by it.
Obsessively so, right? He was attending shows constantly for at least 3 years, studying everything.
He was a natural mimic, a performer. In fact, he meticulously prepared for an acting audition at Covent Garden.
Which he famously missed.
Hilariously, because he had a bad cold. It just makes you wonder how different literary history might be if he'd actually become a professional actor instead of a writer.
Instead, he took those sharp observational skills and turned them to journalism.
He taught himself Thomas Gurney's incredibly complex system of shorthand and became good enough to get a job as a freelance reporter.
Covering legal proceedings and, critically, the often dull parliamentary debates.
For places like the Mirror of Parliament and the Morning Chronicle. And that reporting background was vital. It forced him to capture dialogue quickly, observe character acutely, and turn complex events into digestible stories. He was a master of observation and action.
And his first story was published in 1833.
A Dinner at Poplar Walk, yes. And this journalistic sketching led directly to the birth of his alter ego, Boz.
His early pieces were collected as Sketches by Boz in 1836. I love where that name came from.
It's such a wonderfully domestic detail. Boz came from a silly family nickname he gave his younger brother Augustus. His nickname was Moses.
And if you say Moses with a head cold.
It sounds like Boses, which got shortened to Boz. It's pretty remarkable that the biggest literary star of the age got his famous pseudonym from a common cold.
So professionally and socially, he's on the rise. Fast.
Very fast. He met Catherine Thompson Hogarth, his editor's daughter, in 1834. Married her in 1836. But right after this marital success, he suffered another profound personal shock.
In 1837, Catherine's 17-year-old sister, Mary Hogarth, who lived with them and whom Dickens just adored, died suddenly in his arms.
The shock was so overwhelming that the normally tireless Dickens just completely stopped working.
He couldn't write. He had to cancel the scheduled installments of 2 novels he was working on at the same time, The Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist.
It just shows how deeply sensitive he was, despite the shrewd public persona he was building. He later idealized Mary, using her memory as the basis for these innocent, tragic characters, most famously, Little Nell.
But the event that really cemented his unparalleled fame and financial security was the launch of The Pickwick Papers in 1836.
Initially, the monthly serial wasn't a huge success. But then came the famous Sam Weller bump.
That moment, the introduction of the witty, philosophical Cockney servant Sam Weller in the 4th installment. It was an explosion. It just galvanized the public.
It wasn't just a hit, it was a revolution. The final installment of Pickwick sold an incredible 40,000 copies. It transformed him instantly from a successful journalist into a cultural phenomenon.
One critic even called The Pickwick Papers the most important single novel of the Victorian era because of its impact on the market.
And this is where the entrepreneur really comes into focus. That success spurred this massive, unregulated wave of spin-offs and merchandise.
We're talking Pickwick cigars, playing cards, China figurines, Weller boot polish, joke books.
It was the Victorian equivalent of a massive cinematic franchise.
And Dickens was keenly aware of this commercial power. He was a creature of capitalism, exploiting the new industrial infrastructure.
Just think about the logistics. The new printing tech allowed for mass production, enhanced advertising drew in customers, and the expanding railways let publishers distribute those monthly parts all over the country with incredible speed.
He basically mastered vertical market segmentation. He had cheap bindings for the masses who could only afford a penny or two,
which expanded his readership exponentially.
but he also made sure there were deluxe, gilt editions for the wealthy patrons, maximizing his profits at every single level.
And crucially, he pioneered serial publication. His novels, released in these monthly or weekly installments, weren't just a format, they were a cultural engine. This made stories affordable and accessible.
And it fundamentally transformed mass literacy. It created a communal experience.
Exactly. The sources note that masses of illiterate poor people would pool their money a halfpenny, maybe, to have the new episode read aloud to them in pubs or workshops. He was literally opening up a whole new class of readers to the novel.
And those cliffhanger endings weren't an accident.
Not at all. A deliberate commercial strategy. You had to buy the next one. But the format was also highly adaptive. It let him evaluate audience reaction and, believe it or not, even change plots or characters based on public feedback.
Like Ms. Moucher and David Copperfield.
Right. He improved the character after her real-life chiropodist complained that the character was a cruel caricature.
That immediate feedback loop is like a 19th century focus group. The momentum from there was just relentless.
Oliver Twist in 1838, which is huge, as the first Victorian novel with a child protagonist. Then Nicholas Nickleby and the Old Curiosity Shop.
And that's the one that made him a transatlantic star.
Oh, the stories are legendary. When the Old Curiosity Shop was being serialized, the emotional investment was so intense that American fans would gather at the docks in New York Harbor,
shouting at the incoming British ships.
"Is Little Nell dead?" That level of immediate, intense, transnational emotional response, that's what truly defines a global media star.
And he wasn't just influencing popular culture, he was influencing literary heavyweights. Barnaby Rudge featured the talking raven, Grip.
Who famously inspired Edgar Allan Poe's 1845 masterpiece, The Raven. By the early 1840s, Dickens wasn't just a successful writer, he was a major multi-platform cultural force, and he was ready to use that power.
So once Dickens had built this scaffolding of fame, he didn't just stand on the platform. He used it as a powerful, unforgiving pulpit for social change.
In 1843, the year he wrote A Christmas Carol, is a really significant pivot point for his reformist passion.
What was the specific spark for that story?
It was direct exposure to the horrifying realities of the industrial age. He wrote that novella after visiting and witnessing the dreadful conditions of manufacturing workers and, even more acutely, the neglected children at the Field Lane Ragged School in London.
He was outraged.
So outraged by the indifference of the ruling class that he decided he had to strike a sledgehammer blow for the poor.
And the writing process itself sounds like this frenzied act of passion. He wrote about how he wept and wept again as the story unfolded.
And he confessed that he walked about the black streets of London 15 or 20 miles many a night when all sober folks had gone to bed while he was wrestling with the story.
The impact of A Christmas Carol was just revolutionary. It tapped into old traditions, sure, but it profoundly reshaped and promoted this renewed, family-centered enthusiasm for Christmas in both Britain and America.
It basically codified the modern vision of Christmas, and it remains his most adapted and enduring work. It proved that literature could actually create tangible social change.
And he kept up this commitment through journalism. He edited and contributed heavily to these highly influential weekly journals like Household Words and later All the Year Round.
These weren't just literary magazines, they were instruments of social critique, blending fiction and nonfiction.
He even tried his hand at serious political journalism, editing the Liberal Daily News in 1846. He hoped to advocate for principles of progress and improvement.
But he only lasted 10 weeks. He resigned due to, well, a mix of sheer exhaustion and the crushing frustration of bureaucracy.
But his philanthropy wasn't just theoretical or kept in print. He got physically involved in charity. In 1846, he helped found and actively managed Urania Cottage.
This was a reformative home specifically for fallen women from the working-class prostitutes or women released from prison.
And Dickens wasn't just a name on the letterhead.
No, he managed the operation for 10 years. He set the house rules, he reviewed the accounts, and he personally interviewed the residents to make sure they had a chance at a new life.
He also took clear political sides. He joined the Administrative Reform Association, believing the old, stagnant aristocratic class was the death of England.
His views were truly global. He supported Italian unification leaders like Garibaldi and Mazzini, arguing that a united Italy would be of vast importance to the peace of the world.
And significantly for public health, he published dozens of articles in Household Words, strongly supporting vaccination, praising the pioneer Edward Jenner.
He was, in many ways, a progressive intellectual giant.
Okay, so given that deeply progressive instinct champion of the poor, advocate for women's reform, how do we then reconcile that with the darker contradictions in his views on race and empire?
It's a powerful question about the limits of 19th century progressive thinking. Because despite his very forthright condemnation of American slavery in his travelogue American Notes,
his views on other races and the empire were profoundly inconsistent. Shocking, really.
they were. The sources cite two horrific examples. First, his support for Governor Edward John Eyre's brutal crackdown during the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica in the 1860s.
And secondly, after the 1857 Indian Mutiny, he expressed this just awful desire to, quote, exterminate the race upon whom the stain of the late cruelties rested.
This complexity just underscores the paradox of the man. A brilliant moralist and reformer who was also capable of shocking moral blindness when it came to imperial subjects.
His religious views were also very nuanced.
Very. He was a professing Christian, he honored Jesus Christ, and even wrote The Life of Our Lord in 1846, specifically for his children.
And foreign literary giants like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky even called him a great Christian writer because of the moral force in his work.
Yet his public position on organized religion was highly critical.
He strongly disapproved of what he called that curse upon the world, Roman Catholicism.
And he equally critiqued 19th century evangelicalism. He saw both as limiting personal expression and just fostering hypocrisy. He preferred a broader, more ethical kind of Anglicanism.
Now let's turn to the greatest personal upheaval of his adult life, which happened in 1858.
Right. At age 45, the famous married father of 10 children falls in love with an actress, Ellen Ternan, who was only 18 years old.
And divorce back then was almost unthinkable. It was scandalous, expensive, and carried this immense social stigma.
And the way he handled the separation from his wife, Catherine, was, to be frank, appalling and deeply hypocritical given his moral reputation.
He went on the attack, publicly accused his wife of having a mental disorder, claimed she didn't love their children. He even tried and failed to have her institutionalized before they separated.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning, among others, was reportedly just disgusted by his public statements, which seemed designed entirely to protect his own reputation.
So when that scheme failed, Catherine left, taking one child with her.
And in a very strange domestic twist, her sister, Georgina Hogarth, stayed at Gad's Hill, his estate, to raise the other children, and she stayed with him until his death.
As for Ellen Ternan, The full extent of the affair is still shrouded in secrecy.
Because Dickens, the ultimate manager of his own image, burned most of his personal correspondence in 1860, and Turner destroyed his letters to her.
But the relationship definitely lasted for 13 years, until his death. She was provided with an annuity in his will.
And biographers like Claire Tomalin have argued pretty persuasively that Turner lived with him secretly. He worked tirelessly to maintain this illusion of moral propriety while living a highly unconventional life in private.
It's incredible. It feels like the stage was set for some kind of massive psychological reckoning. The energy required to maintain that secret while being a global celebrity and moral reformer must have been immense.
I think so. It pushed him into the next phase of his career, which became almost purely theatrical.
After the separation, Dickens just threw himself into work, and his lifelong passion for theater found this extremely profitable, though ultimately exhausting outlet: public reading tours.
These tours became the main focus of his creative energy for the last decade of his life.
And these weren't, polite author readings.
No, not at all. His performances were seen by the public as extraordinary exhibitions of acting. He would dramatically inhabit the characters, switching voices and mannerisms with this stunning intensity.
His first tour, from 1858 to 59, involved a punishing 129 appearances across 49 towns.
And what's extraordinary is that despite that grueling schedule, he managed to produce some of his most profound late works.
A Tale of Two Cities in 1859, with that immortal opening line: "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times."
And, of course, the enduring classic, Great Expectations, in 1861. These novels focus so intensely on themes he'd long championed: wealth, poverty, class, and the slow, arduous path to moral redemption.
The public demand was relentless, and the money was irresistible. He took on a grueling Second American tour in 1867, 76 readings in total.
The profits were astronomical. He netted a massive £19,000, which is an enormous sum for the time. He was shuttling between Boston and New York, giving 22 readings in New York's Steinway Hall alone.
But the physical toll he paid was frightening. He was traveling constantly, living largely on this strange, stimulating diet of champagne and raw eggs, beaten in sherry to keep his energy up.
He suffered from severe physical deterioration and what he called the true American catarrh.
But despite the suffering, he did note positive changes in America since his first trip decades earlier. His final appearance in the U.S. was a banquet where he promised never to denounce America again.
Then we get to the pivotal, defining moment of his late life: the Staplehurst rail crash, June 9, 1865.
He was returning from Paris, traveling secretly with Ellen Ternan and her mother, when the train derailed.
The situation was terrifying. The first 7 carriages plunged off a bridge. Dickens was in the only first-class carriage that stayed on the track, just left hanging precariously over the drop.
And he spent the next 3 hours tending to the wounded and the dying.
And what stands out to me is the writer's instinctive priority. Before he left the chaos, he consciously remembered to go back and retrieve the unfinished manuscript for our mutual friend from that precarious carriage. The work literally came first.
But the crash left him deeply psychologically damaged. He had post-traumatic symptoms. He became nervous on trains, suffering from sudden, vague rushes of terror.
And he used that psychological impact as material for his famous ghost story, The Signal Man. And of course, he managed to avoid testifying at the inquest, specifically to keep his relationship with Ellen Ternan a secret.
Disclosing she was with him would have created an enormous public scandal.
It would have destroyed the public image he had so carefully managed.
The relentless pace of the public readings was ultimately what killed him, wasn't it?
It was. His farewell readings were cut short in 1869 after he collapsed in Preston, following a mild stroke in Chester.
And yet, even as his health was failing, he agreed to a final series of 12 performances in early 1870. He just couldn't stop. He needed the adulation.
His very last unfinished project was The Mystery of Edwin Drood. And this novel represents a dark, Gothic turn in his writing. It features a drug-addicted choirmaster, John Jasper.
And the sources connect this dark turn back to his old journalistic roots, his habit of slumming, going into the most derelict parts of London for material.
The character Opium Sal was modeled on Lasker Sal, an elderly addict Dickens met while doing the slums of Shadwell, showing his relentless dedication to real-life observation even as he was dying.
On June 8, 1870, he had another massive stroke after a full day's work on Edwin Drood.
He died the next day at Gads Hill Place, age 58, never regaining consciousness. And there's compelling biographical speculation that he actually had the stroke while in Peckham with Ellen Ternan.
and that she and her maids rushed him back to Gad's Hill to conceal the truth.
Maintaining the secret to the very end. And contrary to his explicit wish for an inexpensive, unostentatious burial at Rochester Cathedral, the public outcry was just too great.
He was interred in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey. The epitaph lauded him as the sympathizer with the poor, the suffering, and the oppressed.
Okay, so if we move from the life to the work, we have to analyze the technical genius here. Dickens wasn't just a popular storyteller mining his life for material.
No, he was a literary innovator who blended multiple traditions into something totally new.
He expertly blended the picaresque novel, that tradition of Fielding's Tom Jones, full of journey and adventure, with melodrama, the novel of sensibility, and most interestingly, Gothic fiction.
And his innovation with the Gothic genre is key. He basically ripped Gothic fiction out of the castles and misty European abbeys.
And set it firmly in the contemporary urban environment, the murky, fog-swathed, labyrinthine London of Bleak House.
That's what created the specific atmospheric style we now call Dickensian. The image of Miss Havisham in Great Expectations, decaying in her wedding dress, surrounded by clocks, stopped at the moment of her trauma.
That's cited as one of his best-known Gothic creations, perfectly transposed into the Victorian domestic world.
But the sources are clear that no writer held a candle to Shakespeare in his mind.
No, he called him the great master, and an unspeakable source of delight. This love of the theatrical, the heightened character, the emotional intensity, it just permeated his style.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's unpack his linguistic mastery, which is arguably what sets him apart.
His style is marked by this profuse creativity, relentless satire, and brilliant caricature, and he worked incredibly hard to develop these arresting, metaphorical names that would resonate with his readers.
Those names are instantly memorable. They provide what one critic calls an allegorical impetus to the novel's meaning.
Right. Think of Mr. Murdstone in David Copperfield. The name immediately conjures up murder and stony coldness. It signals his cruelty before he even opens his mouth.
Or his satirical names, like the noble refrigerator for a snobby aristocrat, or the legal case Jarndyce and Jarndyce. The names themselves are a form of social critique.
And he also maintained incredible control over the visual presentation of his work by collaborating so closely with his illustrators, like Marcus Stone.
This was radical for the time. He didn't just hand over a manuscript.
No, he would brief them intensely before each monthly installment, providing a summary and describing down to the minutest details the characteristics and life history of his creations.
He was ensuring his visual vision, the look of the Dickensian world, was perfectly maintained across both text and image. It was all about controlling his brand.
And his command of language also extended to a brilliant representation of class and dialect. He meticulously used Cockney English to denote working-class Londoners.
A perfect example is the contrast in Oliver Twist. You have the artful Dodger's Cockney slang,
which is sharply juxtaposed with Oliver Twist's own impossibly proper English. This immediate linguistic division tells you everything you need to know about the moral status and social origin of the characters.
He's undeniably one of the greatest character creators in English fiction after Shakespeare.
The sources list characters that are just instantly recognizable. They function as global archetypes. Scrooge, Tiny Tim, Pip, Miss Havisham, Fagin, Mr. Micawber. But they weren't pulled from thin air.
No, many were drawn directly from reality, filtered through his artistic lens. Mrs. Nickleby was based on his mother.
And Mr. Micawber was constructed from aspects of his father's rhetorical exuberance and perpetual financial optimism. London itself is often a character. He called it a magic lantern that fueled his creativity. He walked a dozen miles a day just observing.
And he used these characters, these brilliant caricatures, for fierce social commentary. His novels were, first and foremost, works of social critique.
His critiques were devastating. Hard Times is his most strident indictment of industrial working conditions, where workers were brutally reduced to just being hands literal appendages of machines, rather than people with minds or souls.
And this social activism actually achieved tangible legislative reform.
It did. Bleak House, for example, satirized the glacial pace and absurdity of the judicial system through the fictional, interminable Chancery case Jarndyce and Jarndyce.
And that satire was so accurate and so widely read that it helped build momentum for judicial reform movements.
Which culminated in actual legal reforms in England in the 1870s. That's the true power of his fiction. It changed the law.
His impact was so radical that it resonated across the political spectrum. Karl Marx asserted that Dickens issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all the professional politicians.
And George Bernard Shaw went even further, remarking that Great Expectations was more seditious than Marx's Das Kapital. That gives you a sense of his political weight.
But if we shift to his occasional technical flaws, Dickens is often criticized for his idealized characters and highly sentimental scenes.
Yes, particularly the drawn-out deaths of young characters. Yeah. It's the one point where critics often get sarcastic.
Right. The source mentions Oscar Wilde's famous joke about the death of Little Nell in the old curiosity shop, that one must have a heart of stone to read the death of Little Nell without dissolving into tears of laughter.
And while some critics dismiss this as pure saccharine sentimentality, others argue that his idealized characters, Tiny Tim, Amy Dorrit, Little Nell, are crucial to his social mission.
How so?
Their very innocence and goodness serve to underscore the ugliness and corruption of the social truths he was revealing. The sentimentality was the spoonful of sugar that made the social medicine go down, making readers care about people they might otherwise ignore.
And finally, his reliance on coincidence. Oliver Twist suddenly turning out to be the lost nephew of the upper-class family that rescued him, for example.
Again, this links back to his beloved 18th century picaresque traditions. He used coincidence either for pure comic effect or, more often, to emphasize the idea of providence and fate in a chaotic industrial world. It was a way of imposing moral order on the disorder he saw every day.
So, what's the ultimate takeaway for his reputation? He's the most popular novelist of his time. His works are still in print. His characters are global symbols.
It's staggering. There are at least 200 documented motion pictures and TV adaptations of his works. He really was the first writer to be an object of this unrelenting public interest and adulation. He anticipated modern celebrity.
He's rightly been called the first self-made global media star of the age of mass culture. But let's dig into what that global star status actually looked like. The public readings.
The frenzy. The BBC compared his reception in the U.S. to that of the Beatles decades later. The demand for tickets was unparalleled. Crowds queued for hours.
In New York City, scalpers were so desperate to look respectable, they'd borrow clean hats from waiters to blend in with the crowds.
People sometimes even fainted at his shows from the sheer excitement and emotional intensity.
That level of public adoration is clear. But we mentioned earlier his critical reputation was a bit rocky.
It was. During his middle years, some establishment reviewers noted a drear decline. They missed the bright, sunny comedy of Pickwick and complained he was moving too much toward dark and serious social commentary.
It sounds like the chattering classes preferred their entertainment to stay entertainment.
Precisely. Yet, despite these increasing reservations, the public never deserted him. Sales of his novels and his journals just kept rising. The critics might have been reserved, but the masses were buying.
The major shift in his critical reputation happened much later, around the 1940s.
Yes, that was crucial. Literary figures like George Orwell and Edmund Wilson led a powerful reassessment, which finally placed his later, darker works Bleak House, Little Dorrit, among his finest artistic achievements. They argued that the social critique was, in fact, the source of his genius.
Yeah, and his influence wasn't just contained by the English language.
Not at all. Foreign literary giants revered him. Consider the testimony. Leo Tolstoy called David Copperfield his favorite book. Fyodor Dostoevsky praised his originality, noting, "We understand Dickens in Russia almost as well as the English." Jules Verne called him his favorite writer. He was a truly global literary ambassador.
And then there's that poignant story from the art world, Vincent van Gogh.
Van Gogh was directly inspired by Dickens's novels and several paintings. In an 1889 letter to his sister, Van Gogh stated that reading Dickens, especially A Christmas Carol, was one of the things that was literally keeping him from committing suicide.
Wow, that speaks to the profound, life-affirming emotional power his work held for people facing despair.
And his legacy isn't just about static books, it's about narrative structure itself. That episodic, cliffhanger-laden serial format he pioneered.
It basically laid the groundwork for modern media.
Absolutely. Dickens was producing the 19th century equivalent of a binge-worthy Netflix or HBO series. That weekly or monthly anticipation, the structure where the plot evolves based on audience reaction, you can trace that in everything from soap operas to prestige TV.
And it's not just structural. The screenwriter for The Dark Knight Rises was directly inspired by the themes and structure of A Tale of Two Cities.
His legacy is just thoroughly ingrained in Western culture. Despite his wishes that no monument be erected, statues exist in Philadelphia, Sydney, his birthplace. He even has a crater on Mercury named after him.
And finally, his influence on Christmas is maybe the most enduring non-literary legacy.
A Christmas Carol fundamentally influenced the modern, family-centered celebration of Christmas. It was a cultural earthquake, it popularized Merry Christmas, and permanently etched Scrooge into the global vocabulary as the universal synonym for miserliness. His portrait was even on the Bank of England £10 note for over a decade.
So what does this all mean?
Well, we've unpacked the life of a man whose genius was undeniably forged by suffering. His traumatic experiences in the debtor's prison and the bootblacking factory created this intense, authentic empathy for the poor that became the engine of his entire career.
And he leveraged that suffering, pioneering a new publishing model that merged artistry with capitalism, turning him into an unprecedented global superstar, the entrepreneur who defined modern celebrity.
And he used that unique platform to relentlessly advocate for social change, even achieving tangible legislative results. Yet, the human reality of Dickens is defined by his deep personal contradictions.
The passionate reformer who held troubling imperialist views.
The moralist who publicly disgraced his wife. The tireless advocate for Christ's teachings who despised organized religion. His genius is made all the more intense and lasting because of these profound human flaws.
His personal suffering transformed the landscape of Victorian literature and permanently set the template for how a writer could become a massive, powerful, and ultimately controlling media personality. He truly was, in every sense, the inimitable boss.
Now, here's a provocative final thought for you to consider. Dickens' friend, the illustrator Daniel Maclise, who painted a famous portrait of Dickens in 1839 during his early sunny success, was celebrated in Dickens's last public appearance just before his death. Knowing the full story of his traumatic, exhilarating, and contradictory life, the intense secrets, the personal scandals, and the passionate quest for social reform, what do you think he would have wanted that final, unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, to reveal about the darkness or the ultimate possibility of redemption in his own complex nature?
That is something worth deeply considering as you look at his work. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive. Keep digging for knowledge, and we'll catch you next time.